All right, we're back in the book of Joshua. We're going to be in Joshua chapter 2 through chapter 5 today, and that's what our Sunday School Quarterly is covering for passages. Of course, they're doing this so that we can cover the entirety of the Bible in 10 years. Obviously, if we had anything to do with it, we'd slow down and take at least just a chapter at a time, wouldn't we? But that would take us many years to get through the Bible, and so in one respect, I like this because this allows everyone, no matter who you are, if you attend church for 10 years and you stay with the Bible program that we have for Sunday school, everyone reads through the Bible at least one time every 10 years. Now, it shouldn't be that way. We should be reading through the Bible more often than that, but at least from a pastor's perspective and a Sunday school teacher's perspective, this is a good thing. You get to cover the entirety of the scriptures in a 10-year time. And we know that Baptist preachers would never be able to cover the Bible in 10 years. It takes us a lot longer than that. I've been preaching now for about 25 years, and I can't say that I've even touched. There are some books of the Bible I believe that I haven't touched, and that's shame on me probably, but it's because that we go slower, and we usually take verses or paragraphs at a time and teach and preach over them. And so I say that to say this: as a student, if you're watching these right now and you're interested in learning the scriptures, you need to go ahead before you watch this video and read chapters 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. Get prepared for your lesson, because there's no way that I can touch all of these passages. I'd be going well longer than the prescribed time. When I first started, I always tried to hit 30 minutes. Now I try to stay under 40, but it usually winds up being 45. It's tough to do, but anyway, these chapters here are excellent. This is where you want to pull out the flannel graphs and you want to get your Sunday school class going. You want to get the kids around and teach them these great Bible stories. If you don't know these stories by heart by now, you need to really dig in here, and hopefully this will help you do that. And if you do know the Bible stories and you know all of these things, this is going to be review for you, and that's okay too. I like review. I love hearing these passages. This is probably, Joshua was, I believe, one of the first books that I ever preached entirely through. Parts of it are pretty easy to preach through, like what we're doing now. When they start dividing up the land, it gets a little bit helter-skelter when you're trying to prepare a message, but you can go over a lot more territory at that time. No pun intended. All right, but anyway, we're talking about claiming the promised possession in lesson number 2 in Joshua. We're also preparing some lessons here in the near future on the Sermon on the Mount. That's what we're getting ready to, so you can start looking for a playlist here pretty soon on that in the next couple of weeks. I'll be starting those lessons off in about 2 weeks from now. This is September. This lesson's for September the 11th, so probably towards the end of September of 2022. I should be starting some lessons on that, and then following that, probably at the start of the new year, I've got some lessons started on the book of John, and so I'm planning on getting into that too. So be looking for those coming down the pipeline. That'll be for 2023, but just starting to lay out some lessons and studies and stuff, so be watching for that. And I've got a few other things in the works as well, and looking forward to presenting those to you too. So Joshua chapter 2 is where we're going to begin. Where we left off, remember, Joshua was just taking the mantle from Moses, right? And he was now in charge of Israel. He was the one that was going to be leading them in a place that they were afraid to go before. For 40 years they sat in the wilderness, basically shaking at the thought of having to go over the Jordan River and conquer these cities. What we're going to see in this passage, though, is that they had nothing to fear. And brothers and sisters, this is the big lesson, is that we have nothing to fear. When God is in control, He has already laid out the groundwork for our enemies. We don't have to worry about them whatsoever. We do. We spend a lot of time worrying and fretting about this or that, and there's no reason for it. You know, you look at all of the great stories in the Bible and you find this out. When you think of like David and Goliath, for instance, all those soldiers were standing on that hillside, listening to Goliath taunt them day after day after day, just for a teenage boy to come out there with a pocket full of rocks and a slingshot and go out there and kill the giant. You know, everything. Don't you know? After that, do you know his brothers were jealous? David's brothers were jealous, but don't you know all those soldiers? Whenever they went home, they thought, "Man, we could have done that weeks ago if we would have just trusted God." Brothers and sisters, this is the lesson here. Is that we need to trust God. Trust in God. He knows what's going on. He sees the end from the beginning. He knows all of the things that are going to take place. You don't have to worry about it. He tells us that whenever he gets into preaching there in the Sermon on the Mount, is one of the things that he talks about is not worrying about anything. We worry and fret and all this kind of stuff. Man, I'm telling you what, if I really had any problems at all, I wouldn't have a weight problem, okay? But the fact is that God does take care of us. He knows our needs, and He supplies our needs according to His riches and glory. This is the kind of God that we serve. So as we get into this, I want you to think about that as we cover these passages. So Joshua, of course, is told to take courage. He's taking the reins. Manasseh and Gad and half the tribe of Ephraim are following after. No, half the tribe of Manasseh. Ephraim, Gad, and half the tribe of Manasseh has said they're going to follow just like they had promised to Moses, and they do that. They send 40,000 troops with Joshua and the children of Israel to go over and capture all of these cities that they had been looking at for the last 40 years. Verse 1 of chapter 2 says, "And Joshua the son of Nun sent out of Shittim 2 men to spy secretly, saying, 'Go view the land, even Jericho.' And they went and came into the house unto a harlot's house named Rahab, and lodged there." Okay, the story's already getting pretty interesting here, isn't it? How do you teach that to your beginners class? Well, Joshua sent these 2 spies out from their camp. They go across the Jordan River, and they go into Jericho just to see what's going on there. God must have laid it on Joshua's heart to do this, for Joshua to do that. God never does say that it was wrong for him to do. They had already sent the 12 spies in years and years before. This could have been a disaster, I guess, if these spies came back and said, "Man, don't go in there." But thankfully they had a good report, or we might be reading where they spent another 40 years in the wilderness. We're not told. Okay, but anyway, they come upon a harlot's house named Rahab. Now, everybody probably knows the story about Rahab the harlot, all right? But she is a very, very famous person in the scriptures. Now, we're going to see how this all plays out here in just a second. But to think that God would use a person like Rahab is just unthinkable, isn't it? That out of all the people of the world that he could choose, he chooses a person like Rahab the harlot, and not just for this task, but we're going to find out later that even a better task than that, okay? Or a bigger task, maybe. And it says, "And it was told the king of Jericho, saying, Behold, there came men and hither tonight, and the children of Israel to search out the country. And the king of Jericho said unto Rahab, saying, Bring forth the men that come to thee, and that which are entered into thine house, for they have come to search out all of our country. And the woman took the 2 men and hid them, and said thus, There came men unto me, but I wist not whence they were." All right, and so we find out that Rahab is willing to hide these guys, even though that the king of Jericho asked where they were. She says, "I don't know where they are or where they're from or anything like that." And she goes on to say that they've escaped. I'm going to have to skip over some of these passages, but basically she hid them in the flax whenever they came looking for them, so that these guys wouldn't be hid or wouldn't be found. And it shows her faith in God. As a matter of fact, this is the report that she gave these guys, and this is pretty something special here for them. In verse 8 it says, "And before they were laid down, she came up unto them upon the roof, and she said unto the men, I know that the Lord hath given you the land, and that your terror is fallen upon us and on the inhabitants of the land faint because of you." Now, they knew about Israel already, the people in Jericho, and it says, our hearts are fainting because of you guys being over there. These millions of people are camped out on the other side of the Jordan River. Now, remember, in the hearts of the people, even 40 years earlier, they were shaking in their boots because of Jericho, because of the walled cities, because of the giants in the land. But what Rahab is reporting is what? The people in Jericho were scared of them. All right? And so sometimes we get it twisted around. We think, oh, I can't go talk to this person, or I can't do that. And we get all faint-hearted and everything, when realistically, we're the ones that are supposed to be strong. We're the ones that are supposed to be courageous and get out there and do the work of the Lord, knowing that it's not us and it's not our power that we're able to get it done. It's His power that we're able to get these things accomplished. Isn't that right? And yet we're so fearful and we're so timid. But what we have to understand is that our God is not the one that instills fear inside of us. Fear doesn't come from our God. Fear comes from, that's right, from Satan, right? And from the world. And so they're actually the ones that have the timidity. They're the ones that actually have the fear. It shouldn't be for Christians to be fearful and unbelieving. All right, and she goes on to say in verse 10, it says, "For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, and what ye did to the two kings of the Amorites that were on the other side of the Jordan, Sihon and Og, whom ye utterly destroyed." Now tell me something. How long ago was that God did that? That's right, 40 years ago. Chances are Rahab wasn't even alive at that time. But what she says is, we've heard stories about your God and how that He was able to dry up the Red Sea, and how that you guys were able to destroy the kings on the other side of the Jordan. And so we've been scared to death of you guys, what you're going to do and how you're going to do it. And they hadn't even moved in 40 years, and people were scared. Now, why were they scared? Well, probably because of a lot of reasons. Number one, the stories that they heard. Also, the fact that the children of Israel were able to go outside their tents each and every day and pick up what? That's right, manna. Their God was feeding them right there. And that water was coming out of rocks. All of these great stories that we hear, this made them fearful of those people. All right, so much so that in verse 11 it says, "And as soon as we had heard these things, our hearts did melt. Neither did there remain any courage in any man because of you. For the Lord your God, He is God in heaven above and in earth beneath." Okay, so I see a couple of things here too about Rahab's story. Number one of the things that she mentions here in verse 9 is she talks about the Lord. Now this word Lord here is Yahweh or Jehovah. And so she not only knew about Elohim, the God that created the heavens and the earth, she knew about Jehovah. She knew about the power of God. She knew more about God maybe than some of the Israelites knew, right? And certainly they were more fearful of God and knew about the things that God could do that made her trust in their God. Even though that they had all of these other gods and everything, Rahab had trusted in the God of Israel. Now, she may not have known what to do with that. We're not told at what point that she was saved, but I'm going to tell you something. She gives a pretty good account of herself here, doesn't she? And believing in and trusting in the God of Israel, okay? And so much so that she makes these guys, and I'm not going to read this whole thing, but she makes these guys give a promise that whenever they came into the land, that they wouldn't destroy her or her family. And so the guys did. They made her a promise, and they said, and she let them down by a scarlet rope, And so they said, if you hang this rope out your window and everybody stay in your little house, which was right on the walls of Jericho, then you and your family, whoever's in your home, right then and there, will be saved. Okay? And that's what God did. Now, God was not through. Now, we're not told here in this story, but God's not through with Rahab. God is going to use her in a mighty way. Now, she was a Canaanite woman, Gentile. All right? And yet, what we find as we read through the scriptures is that also she marries a man, an Israelite man named Salmon. And Salmon has a son named Obed, and Obed has a son named Jesse, and Jesse has a son named, that's right, David, who becomes the king. All right, so that would have made Rahab Jesus's what? Or David's what? Giving away the answers here. That's right, his great-grandmother. So there's a chance that David might have known Rahab the harlot if she lived long enough. We don't know. Not told. But at least he knew the stories of this, didn't he? And not only that, but we know from reading the genealogy in the book of Matthew that Rahab was one of Jesus's great-great-great-great-great-great-great grandmothers. All right, and so that, and I've got a whole sermon on this under my Christmas sermon series, but it makes, whenever Matthew said that Jesus came to die for his people, to save his people from their sins, and people start thinking, scratching their heads and thinking, he's got to be talking about the Jews there, right? His people. But then what we find out is we look at his genealogy, not just there, but also there's 4 women that are mentioned in his genealogy. Do you remember? Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and the woman that was Uriah the Hittite's wife, Bathsheba. 4 women are all that's mentioned there. Each one of those women were Canaanite or Gentile women. Tamar was a Canaanite, Rahab was a Canaanite, Ruth was a Moabite, and Bathsheba was a Hittite. So all of these wind up in Jesus' genealogy. As a matter of fact, if you start parsing it down, this genealogy, King David was barely even a Jew by the time he came along. Because if you start halving them all the way down with half parent there and half a parent there, he almost became a non-Jew, all right? Or maybe by the time Solomon came along, because Solomon's mama was a Gentile. So, that all being said, she played a great part in the whole narrative here. So when we look at these stories, sometimes we miss some of the little nuggets that are in here, and that God was able to take this woman because of her faith in him and use her in a mighty way. When we forget what God can do with a life, we've forgotten everything. We look at people and we say, God, maybe we don't say God can't save them, but maybe we'll say God can't use them. And brothers and sisters, there can't be anything that's further from the truth than that. God can use all of us, any of us. We're walking, living, breathing proof of that, aren't we? Every single one of us. Man, he died and saved a wretch like me. How he could use me. We were talking, Kate and I were talking about God calling us and such, and I was telling her, whenever I was going to school, my brother Rusty was already, God called him to preach when he was about 15 years old. And he was a good talker, good speaker. My brother Charles, same way, good speaker, good talker. Me, I was shy, backwards. I didn't want to have anything to do with hardly anybody. I mean, I was just the nature of who I am. And for God to use me in any kind of capacity where I spoke in front of someone or to someone, that would just be, almost unthinkable whenever I was growing up. And people used to ask me all the time, "You going to be a preacher like your brothers?" Say, no way, no way. But you know what? God has a good sense of humor, doesn't he? And he does things just like that, so that when somebody says you do a good job or whatever, this or that, I know that I have to give all the glory and all the praise to the Lord, because it was not in me, never has been, never will be in me. It's always him, that I just have to turn myself over to him and just say, use me however that you want, because I have no idea how to do this. I still get nervous getting up and speaking to people. I get nervous getting in front of the camera, all of those things. But you know what? Faith is where it's at. We have to trust that God knows what he's doing, not us, and that he made us who we are, and he can use us for who we are and what we are. And he even takes those things that we can't do, or everybody looks at and says, God can't use them. And he says, let me show you what I can do. All right. And that is the story of the Bible, all the way through, cover to cover. Man, when we get into the Judges, you're going to see that, especially with the story of Gideon. As a matter of fact, if you want to do a good study, but as we're getting to it, start reading the story of Samson. Look at how gifted that man was, and how unlikely it was for Gideon to be used, and see how much more God was able to use Gideon, being an humble man, than he was able to use Samson, who was very prideful and didn't really use the talents that God gave him at all, and he was given everything. Okay, you can just pit those two guys together. It's actually a pretty good lesson, maybe even a good sermon, maybe a series or something. But I'll let you guys work on that on your own time. All right. Anyway, God can take a person like Rahab and use her, right, for his honor and glory. And we see her used all the way through. And every time that she's mentioned anywhere in the scriptures, it always says Rahab the harlot. Okay, that's what she's known as, because God wants us to understand that he can take someone like that and if he can take and use a harlot, he can take anyone and use them. All right, God's not limited like we are in our understanding and our capacity. God can use them. And when we look down on people, we are not looking the way God looks. We need to start looking in a different respect. And that's why we don't need to be respecters of persons, prejudice, right? Okay, so that's pretty much chapter 2. Let's get into chapter 3 here. We're going to look at a few verses in this chapter as well. Verse 5 is where I want us to start first. Then, of course, now the spies have come back. They told Joshua in verse 24 of chapter 2, he says, and they said unto Joshua, truly the Lord hath delivered unto our hands all the land, for even all the inhabitants of the country do faint before us. And so they gave him the report, and they said, look, everybody is just discouraged whenever they look at us, and God's just given us the land, which he had done 40 years before. I was thinking about that the other day. You know, they were complaining about the manna that they had to eat. But the fact is that if those guys would have done what they were supposed to do, they could have been inheriting the promised land in just a couple of weeks after they left Egypt. But instead, they had to eat that manna for 40 years. And I don't know about you, but when you eat something for year after year after year, you would get a little sick of it. But it was their own fault for it. God was providing for them. But he didn't intend for them to live on manna for 40 years. He was intending for them to be in the land in just a couple of weeks. And manna was just supposed to sustain them until they got into the land. All right, so again, that may be another story or sermon for another time. But anyway, it's just some passing thoughts I had. So anyway, they should have already taken the land, is the long and short of it, right? So then in chapter 3, Joshua rises up early in the morning, and he leaves Shittim, and he starts passing through the land. He tells the people, get ready, because we're getting ready to get out of here. In 3 days, we're going to pick up and leave out of here. So they needed to start preparing. All right, in verse 4 it says, and there shall be a space between you and it, talking about the Ark of the Covenant, of 2,000 cubits by measure. Come not near unto it, that ye may know which way you must go, for you have not passed this way heretofore. And Joshua said unto the people, sanctify yourselves, for tomorrow the Lord will do wonders among you. And so Joshua is preparing the people, and he says, look, God's going to do a wonderful thing tomorrow, but you need to sanctify yourselves so that you see it. Now, this is a very, very good passage of Scripture, and all of them are very, very good. But if you think about this, what was God about to do? How were they going to be able to cross the Jordan? Do you know the story already? That's right. God was going to put his hand down and basically block the Jordan River, dam it up to where it's just going to heap up into a huge pile. All right. So as it's flowing down, as I see it, in my mind's eye, I see it just flowing upwards. And then there's a dry spot where the children of Israel are able to just cross over. And from there on down the Jordan River, there's no water flowing down. And everybody is able to see this water standing up in the sky. So it had to be a sight to behold. And the children of Israel were going to be picking up camp and leaving there and going on into the promised land. Okay? Now, millions of people are about to pick up camp to move. And you have to think about this, because Joshua says, I want you to sanctify yourself, set yourself apart, so that you'll be able to see these wonderful works of God that he's about to perform. And you think, who in the world could miss it? I mean, they are going to be walking across the Jordan River on dry land. They're going to be walking next to a river that's just piled up into the sky. How in the world could you miss that? And why would you need to sanctify yourself so that you can see the wonderful works of God? But remember what else they were going to be doing. They had been on this side of the Jordan River for 40 years. They're packing up all their stuff, all their belongings, all their cattle, all of their herds, all of these things. And if you've ever moved before, and we just got through doing a couple of about a year and a half ago, moving from Vermont down to Texarkana, and that was quite a feat. It's not something that I desire to do very often, is move. I mean, that's a very tough thing. But could you imagine trying to stay focused on anything, and you've got cattle and you've got your older people that you're trying to carry across and all this kind of stuff? I mean, it would have just been bedlam as they were trying to cross over the Jordan River. And certainly with all of that stuff going on, it would be possible to miss what God's doing. I say that to say this. The lesson in it for us is the fact that sometimes we get so busy that we need to set some time apart to think about and see what God's really doing in our lives. Some people just stay so busy that they don't ever see the hand of God. They don't ever see what he's doing. They don't see what he's doing in their lives and their kids' lives and those around them, their church's life. All they can see is all the stuff that they've got going on. And it is just overwhelming. We need to have times set apart, set aside, so that we can focus on God. Focus on what he's doing for a change, instead of what we're doing for a change. It would have been easy for these guys to miss one of the greatest things that they would ever see in their life, and that is the parting of the Jordan River. Some of them probably saw the parting of the Red Sea as a child, those that were born during that time, but it would have been a memory. This was going to happen tomorrow. God was going to do a great thing, and they were going to miss it. Sometimes we need to set ourselves apart so that we can see things that God's doing. Sunday is a great day for that. Whenever we go to church, it's a great time for us to focus on some of the things that God's doing in our lives. I like to hear what God's doing. I like for people to come prepared with a testimony of what God's doing in their life, so that other people can see and hear that God's working. God's doing something. It's necessary for us to do that, because we will miss it otherwise. There's a lot of people that if you say, give me some things that you're thankful for, and they're just going to give you the regular run-of-the-mill things that they're thankful for without ever mentioning what's really going on in their lives today. Is God working in your life today? Was he working in your life tomorrow? Did you see places where God worked? Hopefully you did. But I'm going to tell you something. One of the things that Joshua has them do. Let's see if there's other things I need to cover before we get into this. Yeah, let's go ahead and get into it. In chapter 4, what he does is that Joshua has them, each tribe, to pick up a stone out of the middle of the Jordan River. Now the priests were going to go down and stand. The Jordan River was overflowing in all of its banks. This was during the harvest time, and so the river was flooded over in all of its banks. While they were in the middle of the Jordan, they were commanded to pick up one rock, each tribe. So 12 stones out of the middle of the Jordan River. And they were going to pile them on the other side of the Jordan, where they were walking out on Jericho's side. They were going to put a pile of rocks there. And Joshua says, I want you to do this. These are going to be stones of remembrance. Ebenezer's is what they're called in 1 Samuel. A stone of remembrance, okay? And they did this several different times in the scriptures. You remember, I think of Jacob, where he set the pillar that he had laid on there at Bethel. And that was the place, he set it there for a remembrance, to mark where the house of God was, where he had saw the vision of the angels ascending and descending from heaven. Okay? Whenever God does great things in our lives, we don't need to just go past them. We need to remember them, and we need to write them down, is what I say. Talk about them first. It's good to talk about them. We need to have times of testimony in our church. We're missing that today. We really are. We're missing people getting up and telling about the great things God's doing in our life. And I'm not just talking about prayer requests are good to do. We like to do that. But I also like to hear people talk about what God's doing in their life, even if it means taking a little piece of the sermon time and to talk about it, because people don't hear enough great things about what God's doing. We forget that God is working, and we need to have these times of remembrance of what God is doing in our lives, okay? And we need to mark them down somehow, some way, whether it's in a scrapbook, maybe take a picture of it. We've got phones and stuff that take pictures, if it's something that you can take a picture of, or maybe it's a journal that you keep, a record of the great things that God's doing in your life, or prayers that he's answered. We need to write those things down. Because of this, what he said is that then whenever you are down by the river and you pass these stones, or your children pass by these stones, and they look up at you and they say, why is this pile of stones here? Then you can tell them the story, the recounting of what God did for you there. And what that's going to do is impress on their minds that God does work, and God has helped in times past, and that God can help in the future. This is where we look for our help, is we look to God for help. If we don't have stones of remembrance, if we don't have pictures, if we don't have ways for our kids to remember the great things that God's done in our lives, we need to talk about it. You know, we need to bring it up in our prayers, how God's working in our lives. And I have to really give Kate a lot of credit for this, because this is something that we've done religiously in our prayer times, and as we talk about things that God's doing very regularly in our family, we talk about what God is doing in our life. We try not to let something go by that we don't, but write these things down also, so that whenever you're going through a rough time, that you can look back and say, you know what, it is rough right now, but do you remember when God did this? Do you remember when God did that? And then it reminds you, it recalls to our memory, because Satan has a way of tricking us during those times, making us think, you know what, maybe God doesn't love you. Maybe he's not concerned. And then you can say, that can't be true. God has done too many things for me down through my life to this point to say that he doesn't care about me, that he doesn't answer prayers. Yeah, it's not answered in the time that we might think, or in the way we might think, but God's got this, doesn't he? He's going to take care of it. He always has, and he always will. And so we don't really have anything to be concerned about. And we just grab hold of that book during those tough times, and we say, let's just sit down and talk about the things that God's done for us. And you know what? Maybe it's a little bit of an encouragement for us. And I think that's what these stones of remembrance were for them as well, don't you? And so that's in chapter 4 of Joshua, those stones of remembrance, and especially in verse 6 is where you'll see that. All right, and so then it talks about in chapter 4 how that Gad and Ephraim and Manasseh sent the men over with them to go across the Jordan River to help them to fight. And then and they were able to go across on the Jordan on dry ground. And this is a beautiful thing. Then let's see, in chapter 5, I want to look at verse 1, and then we're going to skip down to verses 12 through 15, and then we're going to be done. That's all I'm going to cover for today. Verse 1, though, of chapter 5, it says, "And it came to pass, when all the kings of the Amorites, which were on the side of Jordan westward, and all the kings of the Canaanites, which were by the sea, heard that the Lord had dried up the waters of the Jordan from before the children of Israel until we were passed over, that their heart melted, neither was there any spirit in them anymore because of the children of Israel." All right, so this goes back to our main lesson here through this, is that God was going to take care of them. All the things that they were afraid of on the other side of the Jordan that kept them living in fear for those 40 years, we can just say that all those fears were very unfounded. And every time, that's what we'll find whenever we step out on faith, is that God has already got this. And so as soon as they crossed over the Jordan, before they lifted a sword, before a wall fell down or anything, God had the spirits of those kings to just melt. And so then, as we are going to see this story unfold in the book of Joshua, then we're going to see that that these kings are going to come up with all kinds of plans and everything to get Israel out of there. But God is going to succeed, except in one case, all right? And that was when Joshua didn't lean on the Lord and didn't ask for God's advice. But we'll see that later on. That'll be a different lesson. Okay. Chapter 5 deals with their circumcision. They had not been circumcising their children since they had left Egypt. All of them were circumcised whenever they left Egypt, but during that 40 years that they were in the wilderness, because they did not trust in God, they did not trust His promises or His covenant, and that's what that circumcision identified, is that they trusted that God was going to be able to take care of the covenant that He made with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob way back there. Circumcision signified that they believed that, and they were passing it on to their children in that covenant. But because they didn't do it, it showed that they were living in unbelief. And so whenever they crossed over the Jordan, the first matter of business that Joshua took care of is he took care of making sure that all the men of Israel were circumcised. And then they stayed in their tents for a while until they were all healed up. And then it says in verse 12, let's see, well, let's read verse 11. It says, "And they did eat of the old corn of the land on the morrow after the Passover, unleavened cakes and parched corn the self-same day." So whenever they walked into the land, the fields were already grown. It was ready to be harvested. They were able to eat corn right out of the fields. What a blessing that was. Again, getting away. And then verse 12 says, "And the manna ceased on the morrow after they had eaten of the old corn of the land. Neither had the children of Israel manna any more, but they did eat of the fruit of the land of Canaan that year." That year. They didn't even plant it. All they had to do was walk over and start harvesting the corn that had already been planted for them. God had already prepared their food for when they crossed over the river. He didn't have to supply manna anymore. Okay, again, think about how much God had taken care of them. And there they were, fearful of all the things that they were going to have to do whenever they crossed over the Jordan, completely unfounded. And God was able to take care of all of their needs according to His riches and glory. He took care of it, and He will take care of our needs as well. I wanted us to see that before we moved on to this last section. Verse 13, it says, "And it came to pass, when Joshua was by Jericho, that he lifted up his eyes, and he looked, and behold, there stood a man over against him with the sword drawn in his hand. And Joshua went unto him, and said unto him, Art thou for us, or for our adversaries. So Joshua sees this man that is close to Jericho, and he has a sword in his hand as well. Okay? And Joshua's looking. Maybe he couldn't see him clearly. Maybe he could. He's looking at him and he says, "Are you for us or for our enemies?" All right? And this man says, "Nay, but as the captain of the host of the Lord am I now come." And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and did worship, and said unto him, "What saith my Lord unto his servant?" Okay, and so we see here that this man says, "I'm not for either one. I'm here on behalf of God. I'm serving him. I don't serve you. I don't serve the Canaanites." Now, this is very important to understand that even though that God used Israel to judge the Canaanites, it was God that was judging the Canaanites. God used them to help him with that, to drive them out of the land. But he is also going to use the Babylonians and some other nations to punish Israel, to judge them for their part whenever they get out of line, okay, on down the line. And so Israel was merely the tool that God used to judge the Canaanites for the sins that they had been committing. All right, and so that's what we see here with this man. And we see, you may wonder, who is this man? Well, we're given some direction, aren't we, into who this guy was? Because what do we see? What do we see that Joshua did whenever he saw this man? Well, it says he fell on his face to the earth and did worship, and said unto him, "What saith my Lord unto his servant?" Okay, so the first key here to understanding who this was is that Joshua was able to worship this man and fall down. And it says in verse 15, "And the captain of the Lord's host said unto Joshua, Loose thy shoe from off thy foot, for the place whereon you stand is holy. And Joshua did so." And so this also gives us some indication to who this was as well. And this is what we understand to be pre-incarnate Jesus Christ. We figure this probably wasn't an angel. Definitely wasn't an angel. Had to be somebody of higher regard than that, because angels will not allow men to worship them. The reference for that would be in the book of Revelation, where John tries to bow down and worship an angel when he saw a great thing, and the angel said, "Don't bow down to me. I'm just a servant just like you are." Okay? And so angels will not allow men to worship them. And so this allows us to know that this was Jesus Christ before he was even born in Bethlehem, which teaches us a few things about Jesus, doesn't it? And that is that Jesus truly is God. Jesus wasn't just there born in the manger. The man Jesus was, but the pre-incarnate Christ has always been in existence. And so Joshua was able to worship him. Also, this man, Jesus, tells, or Christ, if you want to call him Christ or whatever you want to say, tells Joshua to do what? To loose his shoes, for he's on holy ground. Now, when did we see that last? That's right, all the way back there in whenever Moses is at the burning bush, right? When he's standing at the burning bush talking to the Lord, we see the same things are used. And also whenever we see pictures of Christ, many times in the book of Revelation, and also I believe in Daniel as well, we see that Jesus is holding a sword in his hand. And so this has all the attributes of a pre-incarnate Jesus Christ. Christ before he was even born in the stables is what that means. All right. And so he gives him the information that he would need to be able to defeat Jericho, and also I think to give Joshua the courage to go and do what he needed to do, and understand that he was merely a servant in this. That it wasn't even though that he had been lifted up in front of the people, in the sight of the people. Let's see here. I was just looking for the verse. I don't see it right off hand. But anyway, it talks about after they crossed over the Jordan River that Joshua was lifted up in the sight of the people. Verse 14 of chapter 4 is where it is. On that day, the Lord magnified Joshua in the sight of all Israel, and they feared him as they feared Moses all the days of his life. We tend, whenever God lifts us up, even the most humble of people, even the most lowly of people, tend to get the big head sometimes whenever they're given an important position like this. I think about King Saul. He started off with a very humble, very meek spirit about him, but as soon as he was stepped into power, he started doing things that was against God. And so God didn't want Joshua doing that. And so he comes to him and lets him know that, hey, look, there's a higher power here than just you. You need to understand that you are also a servant of the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. We need to understand that as well. God has truly blessed us, and we truly don't have anything to be afraid of, and we can stand and do the things that God wants us to do. But understand that it is not in our power and not in our might. It's in His. He's the one that melted the king's hearts. He was the one that prepared the grain for the people whenever the Israelites crossed over. It was God that did all of those things. It's God that blesses us. It's God that gives us the power and the strength to do what we need to do. Therefore, we need to understand we are still servants of His. All right? We may be His children, but we are also servants, and we need to understand who He is and who we are. Hopefully we've done that, and we will do that. And remember that we need to have courage and can get through all the battles and all of the things that God has for us. All right. Hopefully you've learned something from this and taken something away. And if not, watch it again, or maybe record one and send it to me. How's that sound? All right, let's pray. Father, thank you so much for this study that we have in the book of Joshua. Thank you for the courage and strength that he exude here, and we also are so thankful that you take care of us, that you've already prepared the way. We have nothing to be afraid of, but that we also need to understand that you are in charge, that you are the great I am, that you are the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, and never let us forget that, Lord. Help us to always see you for who you are and us for who we are. Thank you so much, though, that you allow us to be a part of the plans that you have and the accomplishments of getting souls saved. Help us to do our work and do it the best that we can. And it's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Thank you so much. See you next time.